Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Creative Confidence Podcast. I'm Colita Stafford, a partner at IDEO. We always have conversations with special guests on creativity, leadership, innovation, and growth. As you're joining today, I welcome you to note in the chat where you're calling from. And to let you all know, we open up the last part of our portion to questions. So think about them and you can add them in the chat. I am thrilled today to welcome two guests, Steve Schwall and Jan Rod. Hello.
Hello.
And welcome, everyone. So we've got folks from Minnesota, Peru, Melbourne. Jan, where are you at today?
I am based in IDEO, Tokyo.
And Steve, how about you? Where are you joining from?
And I'm calling in from the suburbs of Chicago.
Very nice. So it matches the international audience we have joining us today as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of transportation, specifically how you design and prototype for it. Steve and Jan have decades of experience working in the transportation and mobility space. So as a warm-up to both our guests and to all of you joining, I would love to hear, when you think about the future of transportation or the future of mobility, what do you hope to see? What do you wish for? And I'd love to have you put things in the chat. And Jan, I'm going to come to you first. What do you hope to see?
I hope to see a really human-centered future that will transform our cities so that they are not designed by cars, they are designed by people for people.
Very nice. I think we have, so one person already said they hope to see the end of traffic. Share more. Yep. What else? Steve, what do you hope for?
Well, I think Jan stole my answer, which maybe isn't surprising given our backgrounds. But I also think that to build on that, designing systems that are really centered around people and walking and getting around as a human rather than thinking about technology and bits and bobs moving around our cities.
Yeah. So you both mentioned some human themes. Some of the other ones that are coming up in the chat include end of pollution or more sustainable solutions and just more accessible everyday solutions, which I think speaks to what you both are passionate about, is they really need to work for humans. Yeah. So let me give a proper intro to Steve. Steve is a partner and executive director of mobility, again, out of Chicago. He has a background in industrial design and mechanical engineering, and over 15 years experience working alongside clients like Ford, John Deere, Navistar, and Samsung. Jan is a design director out of IDEO Tokyo and background in interaction design and human-computer interaction. Jan also has straddled both worlds of academia, places like Singapore, and working in the innovation industry. As I understand, you've done humanoid robots in Japan. Yes. So obviously a lot of experience between the both of you. So today I'm thrilled. We're going to cover topics of how you design products that have a really long timeline with large capital investments. This isn't just transportation. It's a lot of industries deal with that. We're going to hear about stories from your work in automobiles, aviation, automotive, autonomous delivery. And we're really going to talk about one of your favorite topics, one of my favorites as well, low-fidelity prototyping and the value of how you can prototype, especially when ambiguity is high or timelines are high and it's complex. So with this, let's just dive into one of the themes. I'm going to start with you, Steve. You both have worked in some of the world's largest transportation companies. And a lot of those times, those timelines are 5 to 10 years towards a future that doesn't exist yet. What are the unique challenges, Steve, to working in industries that have such extended timelines?
Yeah, well, I think anytime you're looking at a really long development timeline, and as you mentioned, when we're talking about building a car or a plane or a new train line, that can be 5, 10, even 20 years of time spent on development and building that out. Yeah. A lot of things can change over that time. So customer needs and behaviors can evolve. The context can change a lot, whether that's regulations or technology or what people are surrounded by. I remember seeing cars hitting the market with the old style iPod docks after Apple had already switched over to a new type of connector. So other things move really quickly. And to that point, many parts of the mobility system also move much more quickly than that. So while I think some of the physical products take years and years to develop. They also have digital interfaces that can be updated, instantly, or services that can be developed much more quickly. So designing these long-lasting physical products that can adapt, but then also, other types of services and interactions that can accommodate old infrastructure. These are really interesting challenges. It's also, I think, an increasingly interconnected space, and so you can't just design a product in isolation. It has to be, maybe many years ago, if you were designing a bike, you could just focus on designing the bike. But now if it's a shared bike system, it isn't just about the bike, it's about all the other components of that system and the community that it interacts with. And lastly, maybe I just say that a lot of times change requires really big investments in this space. So with such long timelines, it's big investments. And so it's tough to make a big risk or try something very new. So it's really important to build confidence and build buy-in for these new directions.
So, Steve, that's a lot of challenges you just summarized. So give us some ideas for how do we navigate that space? And I've heard both of you talk about there are some approaches you can use to approach work that has these long time horizons, a lot of interdependencies. Some things products might move over, multi-year timelines where software is just a few months. So you've mentioned before 4 kind of futuring techniques, and I'd love for you guys to share more about that. So Steve, I'm going to continue with you. Can you share, how do you approach this? Like, give me 2 examples of what the mindset or the kind of way that you approach working in that context.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things, and there's so many interesting ways of approaching the future, but one is to think about ways to talk to your future customers today. So this is, how do we get perspectives from people who are going to be like our customers in 10 years? So that could mean talking with someone who's just getting their driver's license, even though they might not be buying their first vehicle for a decade, because some of their behaviors are indicative of what a lot of future customers might start doing, the way they socially interact, or the technology, how they're interacting with technology. And these aren't one-to-one inputs. There's some sort of translation and synthesis, but it can be really inspiring as you think about the future to look to these potential future customers today.
That's great. That's a great example. What else?
Yeah, and the second one, I mean, related to this, is finding future behaviors that are already happening today. So this is, important things that are happening in other places or other spaces around the world that might be really relevant in the transportation industry 10 years out. So, for example, when we were thinking about the future of the truck in 10 years, we did research in places where our clients didn't even sell trucks or didn't even sell their vehicles, because there were really interesting behaviors happening there, like going to Estonia, which is a very digitally advanced society, and the way that people are interacting with technology, or going to China and seeing how really integrated digital platforms like WeChat are shifting how people behave, because those types of behaviors might be very important in North America, for example, in the future.
Those are wonderful. I have someone in the chat saying too, like, what they hope for is things like widespread EV charging. Like, that is definitely an example of behavior that is happening today that will be part of our future. Yep. So Jan, let's come to you. What else do you think about? You've shared a couple others with me, approaches to how you think about doing this work that's so far out in the future.
Well, I think we already mentioned it at the beginning, but the low-fidelity prototyping, which kind of aims at trying to cover as much ground as possible in our projects to really explore, right? So it's prototyping for exploration rather than for validation. And the low fidelity really kind of serves for us to both be able to move fast and be very kind of nimble and agile in our process, but also bring in the users and kind of give them the space to interact with the prototypes and change them kind of together. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit more later. And the final one was creating empathy for future experiences through those prototypes, right? So it allows us to get a glimpse of what that future might look like and experience it ourselves, right? So if we create this low fidelity prototype of, say, a car body or a car interior, we can sit inside that prototype and, kind of let ourselves be inspired by what the future could bring. And that in turn kind of, allows us to kind of bring these voices from the future into today. We, as Steve was saying, like talking to the future customers and then bringing that back and kind of communicating the story that the prototype tells. That's, I think, another very interesting technique that we are using.
That's fascinating. So I'm going to pause here. And to your point, Jan, we will get more specific. I'm going to have you both share some stories, but let's just summarize these 4 approaches for how you might think about and design for the future. So we talked about talking to your customers of the future today, finding future behaviors that are happening now, prototyping them. And I'm really intrigued by this last one, creating empathy for future experiences. So let's get a little more tangible. Steve, I'm going to come to you, and I'd love to hear some of your stories to just help bring these themes to life. I understand you've done work with autonomous delivery vehicles. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think especially getting to those last 2, in the autonomous delivery space, we were working several years ago with a company exploring package delivery using autonomous vehicles. And there's so many people, I think, going really deep on the technical challenges of that, like how are we actually going to get the autonomous vehicle from point A to point B safely? But in our work, we really wanted to better understand more of the human side of that, what the human value of this technology was for the people on the other end, right? People who are receiving packages or getting deliveries, what's important to them? What needs are we trying to solve with autonomy? And so we tried to prototype the future. So we created an autonomous delivery service that wasn't actually autonomous. There was still a driver. The driver just didn't interact with the customers. So from a customer standpoint, it felt like this autonomous future. And that let us experiment with it and see what mattered to people. And we learned a lot about the what people are looking for from package delivery, right? So how they want packages, when they want it, where they want it, all that really depends on sort of what's in the box, what's getting delivered. And we learned this by prototyping and having real people interact with that. So if they're, ordering a pizza, they want it delivered to their doorstep as soon as possible. But if it's something really valuable, maybe they want it kept safe until they can pick it up on their way home from work. So by sort of building this future, letting people experience it, we're able to learn a lot about their needs, and that helped inform the technology side of it as well, and sort of what the capabilities of these future vehicles should be.
That's such a great story. So, and I appreciate your noting. I think it is, most people default to just trying to get it to function right, just get get a seamless service. But you used really low fidelity prototypes, like things that didn't actually fully function, in order to understand what people actually valued. And it kind of varied on what the delivery was. That's a fascinating insight. How about, let's go to you, Dion. I'd love to hear, I understand you've done work in the aerospace industry. So can you share a little bit about how a case study, examples of how you explore with questions in that kind of space?
So we had the chance to work with JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, which is an equivalent of NASA. And we kind of started working with them about more of a storytelling project, like how might skies be used in the future, which is called Designing the Skies of Tomorrow. And in that project, we really kind of explored the storytelling and the kind of, it was to kind of stimulate the imagination about how skies might be used, right? And then we kind of moved on to space travel, which was really interesting because during the interviews with present astronauts, the team kind of discovered how much of discomfort is at the center of the experience of space travel. And one of the prototypes that, or one of the experiences that they prototyped, learning this insight, was that they took all the props that the space travelers would have, like the packaged food and the way they would sleep in the spacecrafts, and they went camping, right? And kind of just creating this
Brilliant.
situation that would kind of allow them to experience that, right? And then in turn kind of turned into this video where there are these voices of the space travelers from the future that are complaining about all the discomforts of the travel. And it was a really kind of impactful way how to tell that story of how that might look like, right? And I think that what I really liked about that is that what we are trying to do when we are presenting these artifacts to say the stakeholders, right? Or to general public with these projects, we are lucky that we can share this because this is public work. We are really kind of trying to make people not just think differently in the moment, but kind of act differently over time, right? And creating be it a video or be it a 3D printed object from the future, like creating these artifacts that people can very easily understand and and experience and empathize with. That's one of the kind of techniques how to bring a little bit of that future into the present.
So that was a great example. Thank you. And I want to just put a point on a couple of things you said. So one of the techniques you said, we did storytelling. I think that's a really fascinating one. In addition to a very specific prototype, like you mentioned, you went camping to empathize with the same artifacts and type of experience of that. So can you say a little bit more about what you meant by storytelling of the future? Because like I'm looking at what a lot of people are wishing for and hoping for in the chat. And I'm imagining you could probably start by storytelling it.
We are really kind of trying to focus on the human experience, right? Create that connection between ourselves in the present and the people in the future, right? And telling human stories is our way how to connect with those people, right? So rather than just seeing a prototype, there needs to be a story attached to it. And that's kind of how we bring it to life, right? We are telling a story of that prototype, of that experience in the future. And there are real people with real emotions and or hypothetically real, but we are kind of trying to create that human connection, right? Because that's what moves us as people, as designers. And I believe that that's kind of what in turn makes us act and be much more kind of connected to that potential future.
Thank you for sharing that. I think we overlook the kind of storytelling. We just think about how to make it look and feel like something. So let's go there though. Let's talk about prototyping. And I want to bring up this word, you've mentioned it before, fidelity, low fidelity, high fidelity. So whenever you're designing products or services for long timelines or a future that we don't yet quite know, you can intentionally choose what fidelity you prototype in. So I'm going to take a stab at you guys, correct me. So like the idea of a high fidelity prototype, like if we were to say a car, it might actually drive, it would actually function. That would be a high fidelity prototype. Versus a low fidelity might be, it's just some chairs and some cardboard for a dashboard and some paper for the displays. So is that how we can help us understand, what do you mean by low fidelity and high fidelity as a range?
Yes, I think you got it. You got it perfectly right. And we would often, tape out just with the masking tape on the floor, kind of like the size of the car interior, and then play with it, right? That's kind of like what would the low fidelity prototype be like. And we would use office chairs and IKEA couches that kind of fit, vaguely into that space. But maybe the point that I wanted to make here was about, I think that a lot of people in the design industry are kind of accustomed to use low fidelity prototyping for speed, but what my experience was, especially in the mobility space, is also kind of lowering that bar to give users permission. The people that we are co-designing with, that we bring to work with us, to tell us about, you know, their needs and their desires and their expectations from cars, like lowering that fidelity to the point that allows more space for imagination, and
space.
kind of creates this you know, permission for people to go around and change things, to kind of really kind of make them part of that process, right? Because I think that, you know, if the prototype fidelity, you know, goes across a certain bar, suddenly it starts to be a little bit intimidating.
Got it. I'll come back to that. Steve, anything else you want to add to what are the benefits of low fidelity?
I think that one of the great things about low fidelity prototypes is it lets you sort of focus people's attention on the things that are most important for you in that moment. So a lot of mobility products or services are very complicated, right? You get into a car and there's so many things going on, and there's a lot of things that you could give feedback on if you're a potential user, or, you know, the security experience of the airport, going through that experience. There's so much to take in and so much to manage. And so when you're prototyping at low fidelity, it lets you really simplify and focus the customer or the stakeholder's attention on the questions that you're really trying to answer at that time. So often you might be in this mode of really trying to figure out sort of what the right thing is to build, not necessarily all the details of it. And so if somebody says, you know, I don't really like purple, or I don't like this font you chose, that's not particularly helpful. And so doing something in foam core, for example, where someone's not going to see that as the finished product, it lets you make sure their attention is focused on those questions that you're trying to get at.
That's so helpful. And Steve, maybe let's continue with you. And then Jan, I want to come back to your example of, you said you duct taped on the floor, but Steve, tell me more. Can you give me example of that? I understand from aviation, where just give me even more details of how you create a low fidelity and what that unlocks.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things to do with a low fidelity prototype, I mean, I think sharing it with customers is great, but I love to put some of the stakeholders in those prototypes. So we were working with a startup to define sort of the customer experience for a new aircraft, right? New to the world aircraft. And this is a great example of a product with a long development timeline, right?
Yeah.
This is 10 years or so to develop this. And along that way, there's a lot of decisions, there's a lot of trade-offs that have to be made, often pretty early in that process. And so when we started working with a client, they were having a lot of conversations about, you know, important topics, important trade-offs. You know, how many passengers can we fit in this craft? Like, what's the business model? And there were, I think, a lot of those conversations were happening in the abstract, and it was really tough to understand what the impact of those decisions would be for the user and for the traveler. And so we actually took over a section of our studio in San Francisco, and just using wood and foam core, built out a section of this future aircraft in a very quick amount of time, and put in some seats and put in, you know, some foam core things that people could move around. And then we had their next meeting inside the plane. So bringing those stakeholders and executives into the plane and letting them experience what it felt like. And, you know, how did it feel to put this many people in, or to have the seats this close together? And the conversation was very different than, you know, looking at a spreadsheet or thinking through something in the abstract.
Yeah, that's such a great example. I like your point. It's taking it out of the abstract into a tangible, and doing so creates a different dialogue, maybe unlocks some different questions and some different insights. Yeah. So Jan, I want to come.
I mean, I think I was just going to say, I think, you know, in that situation, the aircraft had to be very small, very narrow, but we wanted to create this luxury experience. And so feeling what it was like inside a space that might feel cramped, we sort of unlocked the ability to take some things out of that space and actually create a more open and sort of luxurious experience. And I don't think we would have gotten there without getting inside the plane that early.
That's wonderful. And by the way, there's someone joining us right now who's also talking about at their airport, they are also doing low fidelity prototyping to engage more diverse stakeholders from management, and it's being very successful. So bravo to all of you already doing these in your spaces. Jan, I do want to come back to hear a little bit more of your example, and then I do want to open up to questions. So we encourage folks, add in your questions for Jan and Steve. So Jan, you were mentioning a low fidelity prototype that helped encourage participation. Do you want to share a little bit more about the details of what you did or what it unlocked?
Right. It was a project with one of the Japanese automakers, and it was kind of focusing on what a future interior could look like. Because one of the insights that we learned early on was that, especially in Tokyo, where there is a severe lack of space, people were very often using cars without moving around, right? That would use them. And it was a really interesting kind of data driven study that found that people would be getting into car sharing and not driving anywhere, right? And so digging deeper, we found out that people would be using these spaces for lounging, eating in private, having meetings, because it's available, it's on the street, right? And you can jump in, stay there for 30 minutes, and it kind of drove a project around interior exploration. And one of the things that we did there was just really kind of bringing users in our space to this area where we would kind of tape out the interior, prepare the furniture, and kind of have them imagine different situation, how they might be using the car, and kind of arranging it. And then another twist to it would be that we would point the camera at that prototype and kind of capture what they were doing, and then we would recreate it in a much higher fidelity and bring them from that space to another kind of part of our studio where we would show them the higher fidelity, right? And it had this really kind of magical effect on people, that they would be like, oh wow, okay, this is amazing, right? That's what I just kind of did there with like chairs and tables, and here's a much higher version, a much higher fidelity version of that.
That's wonderful. I think everyone on listening today would love to be able to tap into all your toolbox of all the ways that you approach these moments. And so I am going to switch the questions. And one of the questions is around prototyping materials. So this comes from Ben. What kind of light materials or quick strategies do you have for a design team to think about full-size experiences or prototyping? In his question, particularly autonomous vehicles. But yeah, what's your recommendation list on quick and light materials to prototype? I'll start with you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I can share a few basic things. So first of all, I'm a big fan of foam core because there's a lot of magical things you can do. That it's lightweight, it's easy to cut.
What is foam core, in case you're from a country or an area that doesn't have that?
Yeah, so it's a paper-based product with essentially two pieces of paper with some foam in between. So it can be a quarter or half-inch thick. I won't try to translate that to metric on the fly. Sorry about that. And it's easy to cut. It's easy, but it holds its sort of shape and structure. And there's some wizards in our shop who can turn it into a lot of different forms. But also another thing we'll do often if we're dealing with a sort of fixed space is just build a simple outline of that space using aluminum extrusion, so something like 80-20. And then you can build a lot of things on top of that, and you can take it off and put new things on. And so it becomes sort of this platform for experimentation, and this platform that you can try a lot of different things on without needing to start over from scratch.
That's great. How about you, Jan? What is in your short list of recommendations for materials?
I really like scrappiness. So kind of, just keeping a stock of, materials, be it foam core, aluminum extrusions, plywood, paper, office furniture. I think that, it's really about the imagination and the ingenuity of the design team. And I think that in that context, in the context of the low fidelity prototypes, kind of, I don't want to say anything goes, but in a way, anything goes. I think that scrappiness and kind of, not overthinking things is also my kind of favorite approach.
Got it. Thank you. I want to move on to another question. Actually, I do want to, one last thing for Jan and Steve. I think it goes back to, you would say, it depends on the question of what you're trying to learn. So your prototype should be as low fidelity as it needs to be to explore the question you're trying to learn. So anything you want to just kind of put a finer point on that, or do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that the answer to the favorite prototyping materials could be much longer because, to your point, it really is for me just a very fun design exercise to think about what is the simplest, fastest, cheapest way that I could create something that helps answer the question that I could share, that people could interact with. And so sometimes that can be a sketch, sometimes that might be going into virtual reality, sometimes that might be sort of a Wizard of Oz behind the curtain service you're creating. And it's an endless exercise to sort of imagine and come up with new ways to bring experiences to life really quickly.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to another question. This is a great one. It has to do with public policy. So this comes from Rachel. Can you share any experiences where public policy is a consideration in your prototyping, especially it feels like sometimes public policy is usually something that comes very late into the picture rather than it driving some of the early decisions. So either of you have some perspective on that? I'm going to go with you, Steve. I see you kind of lit up. I think you've worked in this space before.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a great question. And I think one of the exciting moments we're at in the sort of transportation and mobility space is that there's so many, I think, new technologies changing that are shifting kind of regulations and policies, but also an awareness that the mobility system has such an impact on communities that engage directly or indirectly with it. And so I think policy is shaping that a lot. And so I think in some of our work, one of the things that we've been doing a lot more of is when we're thinking about who the users and stakeholders are, of really drawing a much bigger circle around that and looking at that ecosystem of people that the product or service or mobility system we're working on will affect and intersect with. And you start to see the role that policy will play in ensuring that the sort of outcomes in the products will provide value or good experiences for very indirect users of the product as well as the direct users.
Mm-hmm. I want to build on that with thank you for sharing that. And I think so. Adam is bringing up a question too related to that. Like a lot of these industries deal with a lot of constraints, be it policy. I've heard both of you talk about increasingly this work doesn't just reside in one industry. It doesn't reside in just one, like Jan, in your case, the aerospace private client. It overlaps with government. It overlaps with the public sector. Do you have either of you have any other just perspectives to add on working in spaces that often involve collaboration across different sectors? Well, I'll go to Jan. Anything you want to add on that?
I was just waiting if Steve wanted to, if Steve had in mind. I mean, that's kind of one thing that I would really like to see more of, right? Being able to, we talked about bringing stakeholders, into the prototype and showing them the experience. And that would be my hope for the future, that we can do that with a more diverse set of stakeholders where, because there is just so many, like the systems are becoming so complex that they just influence each other, right? And, car makers, policies, technology makers, software companies, like that all comes together, and kind of, being able to open up, this collaborative or create these collaborative relationships to kind of like really look at what's happening at the interfaces between, policy and making cars, right? Or, making autonomous cars and creating, or changing traffic rules, right? And so I hope that, we can get to the point where people kind of, start realizing more that we need to kind of step up the collaboration between these different stakeholders.
Yeah. So Jan, I'm going to keep you in this space for a moment, because we did have someone, Gloria asked, interested in the future as it relates to airspace and drones, which is exactly in that intersection you talk about. interested in what the future, of air corridors might mean for unmanned aerial drones and the latest thought leadership. Anything you have on that topic?
I mean, that's one of the kind of reasons why organizations like JAXA come to us, right? Because they have a stake in that conversation, and they want to be able to imagine what the future possibilities might look like, right? And through that kind of drives their thinking about, well, what might be the rules that we need to create or change to be able to realize some of those futures, right? And so I think that this is the way we are kind of trying to open up that conversation by showing the possibilities and by kind of sparking that imagination in people.
Great example. So we have time for about 2 more questions. I'm going to go to one that is around shifting gear. The topic is really about adoption and the adoption life cycle of some of these new things. So this comes from Simon. Do you have any techniques you can use to help predict or manage the adoption life cycle, like where customers will change with new forms and it becomes more widespread from like early adopters to the masses? Any guidance on thinking about the adoption life cycle?
Yeah,
Steve, I see you getting ready. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's been so many interesting places in automotive space I've worked in recently where that's been so important. I mean, electrification is a big one. We're understanding when are we going to hit that tipping point where that technology really becomes more widespread. And I think that the last couple of years have been really exciting from that perspective. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet, but I do think that there's a few things we do that help with that. I think one is really thinking about the system. And we've talked a lot about not just focusing on a product or a technology and the adoption of that, but actually looking at the interrelating factors that have to come into place for that technology to be adopted. So to continue with the electrification example, looking at the infrastructure around it, looking at the early adopters and how they're interacting and how they're seeing value from that new technology. By looking at that systems view and considering a lot broader spectrum of factors for what needs to be true for this technology to really hit widespread adoption. I think that's one way that like a design-led approach can help answer that question.
Okay, thank you for that. So the last one before we start to wrap up, Jan, I'm going to come back to you because it has to do with co-creation. So we have folks asking, how do you set conditions to motivate people to really engage in the co-creation process? So you named some things. Anything else you want to any other expert advice?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's really about creating a safe space, for psychologically safe space for people to kind of come into those sessions with excitement and without fear, right? I think that a lot of this kind of type of stuff can be a little bit intimidating, right? There are people who are so-called experts in the room, and they are designers, and when you have a kind of like a regular person coming in, there is kind of perceived difference in power balance, right? And so we try a lot to kind of create this safe space and to really focus on making people feel comfortable and kind of like really working with them to kind of unlock that creativity, right? And and through that, and kind of like making them our partners and kind of helping them understand that we are doing the work in service of them, right? We are doing it for them, right? And so it's really about kind of being human-centered also in that prototyping process, in the co-creation sessions. That would be kind of my take on the question.
I appreciate that. I think there's this default of things like transportation, because the stakes are so high and so complex. When bringing people to co-create, it's often a very high, like you said, a very high fidelity prototype, or a very very developed idea, which doesn't invite builds on it. And so this is another case for why lower fidelity, by nature of the materials and the kind of setting, invites a different type of conversation and participation. Yeah, it's very counterintuitive.
Absolutely. And what I wanted to build on there, kind of going back to the point, prototyping to explore, prototyping for exploration, right? And kind of really, making people understand that, what we are interested in and what they are bringing to the table is their lived experience, right? It's not a design expertise. It's a lived experience that kind of creates that magic, right? Because they have been using those products. They have been using cars for years or for decades or other products, right? And they have this kind of innate understanding of, what needs to change.
Yeah, thank you. Steve, any last builds on that? And then I have the last question for you both.
I would just say that I've found that people are often just so excited to engage. So many times it doesn't take a lot to get them over that hump. I think whether it is making the opportunity to make somebody else's life better and, contribute their thinking, or to make their own life better and the products they use better. I think that oftentimes people are so excited to be heard and listened to and able to engage in that process.
Well spoken. So thank you, everyone, for all your questions. I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to tackle all of them. We've been talking today with Steve Schwall and Jan Rod from IDEO and their expertise on the future of transportation. My last question for you two is quite simply advice you would have given to your younger self, given all the experience you've been through. As you think about that, I'm just going to wrap up for folks. Again, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about the themes discussed today, especially prototyping, we would love for you to check out our IDEO foundational course called From Ideas to Action. And you can learn more about that at ideou.com/ideas. And with that, let's talk about advice you'd give to your younger self. I might go to you, Jan, and then I'll have Steve, you take us home.
I would probably focus on, as a younger designer, I very often kind of used to be obsessed with tools and obsessed with fidelity and kind of making things perfect. And I think that I would trade now a lot of those hours spent in front of, CAD or, UI prototyping tools for, practicing more storytelling and practicing more of this kind of empathy for users, which I think is what, really kind of deeply drives the design that we need to be doing.
Wonderful. How about you, Steve?
I think that when I was a younger designer, I was really sort of interested in finding that perfect idea. What's the right idea that's going to perfectly solve this problem? And I think that as I've spent more time working in this space, I've found that it's not about necessarily that big idea, but actually helping to build confidence and align the people and the capabilities and all the things that have to come together in order for an idea to come out in the world and make an impact. And so shifting less from focusing on the perfect idea and more about how to foster and get those ideas out into the world is something that I would encourage others to do as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone else, for joining. Again, we're talking with Jan and Steve today on the future of transportation and a lot around the value of low-fidelity prototyping. Thank you both for being here. And that's it for us. Bye, everyone.